I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've been working this through your head over the weekend, and were you briefing the President of the United States right now? How might you do that?
This is a work in progress, a lot of uncertainty. We're through Act 1. We don't know whether this is a 1-act play or a 5-act play. We don't really know the terms of this settlement that has been worked out with Prigozhin, with Putin's blessing. We don't know whether it will be complied with. But even if it turns out to be Act 1 of a 1-act play, this has been an earthquake within the Russian political system, and it's going to take a while for its effects to be clear over time, as it plays out over time. So in light of that, one of the things the president would say would be, well, what are our objectives here? And I think our objectives in this situation are twofold. One, to continue to try to get Russian forces out of Ukraine, and to assure that Ukraine's sovereignty, integrity, and viability as a secure and prosperous state is maintained. And the second objective, I think, is we do not want to encourage a Russian civil war. The consequences of that for regional instability, for refugee flows into our allies, from questions about who controls the nuclear weapons, these are troubling questions that we'd like to avoid. So those would be the objectives. Second question, well, what do you say about this publicly? Because the administration is going to have to talk about it publicly, and I think the statements made over the weekend are pretty close to right. Watching the situation, internal matter to be resolved among the Russians themselves. But I think we should emphasize that it's further evidence that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a strategic mistake for Russia, that Russia troops should leave Ukraine, whether they're withdrawn or whether it's 1917 style, they put down their arms and they decide to walk home. And because Russia clearly has to attend a lot of internal affairs. That's clear from what we've seen over the week. What to watch for going forward, the president would ask. Well, Putin has clearly been weakened by this. Prigozhin's forces got within something like 150 miles of Moscow. They received tacit support, I would have to say, or at least not active opposition from the Russian security forces. That's a problem for Putin internally, and I would expect you're going to see some purges of his security services and further crackdown internally. His problem is whether he can pull it off. It's a little bit like kids playing with mud pies. Sometimes, you know, the tighter you squeeze, the more mud squeezes out between your fingers. We'll have to see how Putin does. I think the other thing for Putin is he's going to have to try to frustrate the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because the more Ukrainians are able to take back territory from Russian forces, the more Putin looks weak and the more the Ukrainian war looks like, as Prigozhin has been saying, a strategic mistake for Russia. There's a question about Prigozhin. He's got to stay alive. He's been called traitor by Putin. People who are called traitor by Putin don't usually have a very long life expectancy. He's got to decide whether this is over or whether this is Act 1 of his effort to confront the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and Gerasimov, the head of Russian chief of the Russian General Staff, and whether he wants to continue this campaign or not, and if so, how he would do it. There's a question about the future of the Wagner group. They're supposed to be either demobilized or brought within the Russian MOD. Will they do that? Will they continue to be a force? If not in Ukraine, what about their continued presence in Africa? A lot of uncertainties there. Questions for Ukraine. This is potentially an opportunity for them to more effectively push their counteroffensive, because if you are already demoralized Russian troops on the front line with Ukraine and you look at what's going on at home, it may make you even less willing to fight. That may be an opportunity for Ukraine. Questions for China. Xi Jinping cannot afford for Putin to go down, and China and Xi may decide that the best way to save Putin is to put pressure on him to bring this war to a close, which has to involve withdrawal of Russian troops. Question of how this affects China. And finally, I would expect the administration to be going around with friends and allies, but particularly with fence sitters around the world, South Africa, Brazil, India, saying, you know, do you really want to be neutral and be perceived as supporting someone who is as weak as Putin. This was a bad bet. Now it's time for you to change your bet. Seems to me those are the things that the president would want to be watching to understand where this is heading over the longer term.
I'm not going to try to impersonate any president of the United States, but that was just a terrific briefing. If you're managing this and looking at the situation on the ground, is it restabilized, or is this a beginning of a long period of instability? Will we see a Game of Thrones where people around Putin see, well, this is a time to move? The way it's been described to me by one really interesting analyst is that there were four sort of power centers. One of them was the FSB, Special Ops, all the troops around there, including the Presidential Guard, which is a very terrific bunch of troops around Putin that he can rely on. The second power is the military, the defense ministry. There's some talk last night that the deal with Prigozhin was that the people he's been criticizing, Shoigu and Gerasimov, will step down. Hard to believe that Putin would actually negotiate that with Prigozhin at a time, a person he called a traitor, but that's what's out there. The third is the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group has made riches from its work in Africa, but those are also Putin's riches. Who do they listen to in Africa right now? Prigozhin, and the fourth is the Chechens. We haven't talked much about the Chechens, but they play a pretty big role, and they probably have many more troops at their behest than just the ones that are under the Ministry of Defense. What we do know is if these are the power pillars, that they've been shaken. That whatever stability there was, however fragile it was, it's shaken. So how unstable does the situation remain? And then, what role does the President of the United States with his allies play in this kind of situation?
Unknown. There are other speakers you're going to get to this morning who are probably better positioned to talk about that than I. I'll give you my take. So why did Putin do this deal 6 or 8 hours after he called Prigozhin a traitor and promised the most draconian kinds of punishment? I think there are probably 3 reasons. One, the progress Prigozhin made moving towards Moscow and the fact that it was really fairly unobstructed, I think and if you look at the preparations that were going on in Moscow, they took this push very seriously. I think that was one reason. Secondly, I think Putin realized that the longer this went on, the more likely Prigozhin's narrative that the Ukraine war was a mistake, that Ukraine did not threaten Russia, and the brotherly relations between Ukrainians and Russians could have been restored without force. The longer Prigozhin has success, the more that narrative might catch on within Russia. And secondly, I think Putin had to worry about schisms and breaches within the security services themselves. Putin has been balancing these various groups you talked about for a long time and fairly effectively. He either didn't see this one coming or didn't step in soon enough. Where this goes depends a little bit on whether Putin regains his footing, is able to do a crackdown and a purge for those that were disloyal, and is able to restore this sort of balancing act that he was doing before. So in some sense, his future is in some measure in his own hands. In terms of the U.S. role, I think the instinct, it's very difficult to know what's going on, and I think our effort to try to affect what's going on from the outside just would justify all kinds of anti-Western, anti-U.S. narratives that Putin has based his rhetorical strategy on. So my guess is the administration would and should stay out of this matter.
Accelerate our help for Ukraine, or just keep it on?
Of course. Yeah. This is the opportunity. This is the opportunity for the Ukrainians to exploit what looks like chaos in Russia and maybe a degraded morale among Russian troops to try to effectively retake Ukrainian territory from Russian forces if they can.